México Profundo, una civilización negada, en español, and México Profundo, reclaiming a civilization. And last night I couldn't sleep because I was typing away. Let's see if it makes sense. Then I'll take some questions towards the end. But it says, México Profundo, reclaiming a civilization. In reading this book, it should be first noted that although the author, Guillermo Bonfil-Batalla, has asserted with accuracy the issues that keep our people in the European colonial matrix, there are things that we should keep in mind. This book is not perfect. Bonfil-Batalla, throughout his book, uses the word Indian to make reference to our full-blooded Nicantlaca. Nicantlaca, the word that we were trying to introduce to our people. Although he understands and does not acknowledge the idea of mestizaje, at times he separates from himself, meaning us, from being the indigenous that we are, falling occasionally into the trap of the mestizo idea. He also addresses the issues in a more nationalistic level, meaning referring to Mexico, and not looking beyond as more like as this continent, just like as Mexico and Central America, the so-called North and South America, or Semanahuac, the way the Mexica Movement sees it. Nevertheless, what Bonfil-Batalla has produced in his work is inspiring, and he courageously dared to lay down a foundation on how we as an indigenous people could eventually add and build upon. Guillermo Bonfil-Batalla begins by painting a picture of the terrain and the climate that gave birth to our Anahuac civilization, from the formative period in the warm lands of Veracruz to the earliest domestication of corn in the Tehuacan Valley in Puebla, Mexico, about 9,000 years ago, and other foods such as squash, beans, chiles, tomatoes, etc. In the case of corn, it should be noted that it was Anahuac's momentous achievement. It was an inseparable link to our civilization. Corn, more than any other food, was highly revered in all of Anahuac. In honor of corn, structures were built, literature written, works of art created, and mythology recited. We knew that corn without human intervention could not survive, and we could not survive without it. It is no wonder that our people saw themselves as children of the corn, and at the same time we saw ourselves as the parents of corn. He reminds us that we are the heirs of one of the few civilizations that the world has ever seen, beginning with the Olmec and what today is known as Mexico and Central America, then after with the other major groups such as the Zapotecos, Teotihuacanos, Mayas, and ending with the Mexica. It was this last of our civilizations that was in power when the Spaniards invaded our lands in 1492. We should also add, it is because of the Mexica that we get the word of Mexican, Mexicano, and Chicano. We also recognize that many foods and names in Mexico and Central America come from this language, the language of the Mexica. These are the names as far as Mexico, Mexico, states, rivers, mountains, foods. In fact, there is a great abundance of words presented in Spanish that most of our people speak. Before the Spanish invasion, it was not just Nahuatl that was spoken, hundreds of other indigenous languages. Today, it is estimated that at least 56 Nicantlaca languages are spoken in Anahuac. In the beginning chapters, Batalla makes his case for México Profundo, or shall we say Anahuac Profundo. He explains on how we mostly speaking of our people in Mexico, but we could extend this to the majority of our people. He's saying basically that a lot of our people know something about this indigenous past. We know about the archaeological sites. We know about Indian art, and it is assumed that it's glorious but dead. Something that is appealing only for tourists. He explains, we do not recognize this historical connection or continuity with the past. Some believe that Anahuac civilization was destroyed by the European invasion. Others seem to regard that event as a sort of redemption. What remains of Anahuac is regarded as ruins, some stone, but others still living. We accept and utilize the pre-colonial past as a history of some national territory, but not as our past. They are simply Indians, the Indian part of Anahuac. The racial demographic in Mexico is far greater than we assume to be. The indigenous element is everywhere, even in places where European or Westernization is most prevalent. But the intent of destroying any indigenous element has not stopped Bonfil-Batalla. Bonfil-Batalla calls this de-Indianization, o la desindianización, está grande la palabra. The process of purging or destroying the indigenous in us. In the Creole controlled Mexico, we see it through the decimation of white faces in every aspect. From the novelas to the magazines to some sort of advertising, we are told what beauty is, and it's not indigenous. We see it every day on TV where being dark or Indian is equated with being corrupt or bad. Connotations are created to assert this racism, such as the word naco. Hearing Mexican music or behaving or saying something in a certain way puts you in that category. I also mentioned earlier, as far as like the whole word of plebe, plebada, that's another basically another word that was basically in as a use of basically belittling our people. It is very difficult for our people today to make this indigenous connection. Since the fall of Tenochtitlan, when our people were in control of our lives, of our destiny, the idea of the lazy, primitive, ignorant Indian has been manufactured. Bonfil-Batalla makes a good point in saying that after the defeat of Tenochtitlan, and then a genocide that ensued, the Spaniards took over our cities and turned it into seats of colonial power, and the countryside was the realm of the colonized. It is perhaps here where some of our culture survived. Some of our people had to flee the cities to escape the horrific treatment of the Spaniards. Also, it is probably here where the racist idea of los indios bajados de la sierra grew out of. One thing for sure is the fact that hundreds of years later, we can't imagine ourselves as city dwellers, city builders. The idea was destroyed in us, and once again added to the racist idea that we cannot possibly have been the creators of a civilization. Many colonial cities were built on top of culture centers. We see that in present-day Mexico, where remnants of our past are bleeding through the colonialist structures. We see it in the city of Oaxaca, where we could practically find a block, in every block a church, some big, some small. In Cholula, where a massive church was put on top of the biggest pyramid in the world, our most sacred Teocalli. Today, we can't imagine ourselves descendants of this indigenous culture. We go about in our daily lives practicing elements of our past without even knowing it. For example, we know that most of our foods are in its core Nicantlaca, but also the way we cultivate some of these crops. You can see it in almost in every household. The tomato plant in the backyard, or the chile plant in a pot. I personally seen our people use a limited amount of space in their work area to plant some of these crops. We also use remedios caseros, like the use of ipazote, el té de aguacate, and many more. But we don't realize that even the idea of, for example, in Mexico, la vecindad is Nicantlaca, where private rooms are aligned along a common patio, and bathrooms, washrooms, water taps, water basins, and play and work areas are shared. This Batalla tells us tends to strengthen relationships between the inhabitants and generate a group spirit. But much as what we go from practicing indigenous elements without knowing, if we also practice the European. Batalla calls this phenomenon schizophrenic, where we live a double life going from one world to the next, but always aiming to accept the imaginary Mexico, el México imaginario, or the imaginary Nahuatl, where only a minority rules, that being the European. In Guatemala, where the vast majority of our people are full-blooded Nicantlaca, the Ladino, the mixed-blood Nicantlaca who embraces the rape in him, conveniently adopts traits or Nicantlaca culture, but, as Batalla cites Guzman Buckler, who had written that the Ladino is a fictitious being because the essence of his identity is negative, being Ladino or mestizo in this case, is not being anything specific of one's own, but just being not indigenous. Since the European invasion of our lands in 1492 to the present, there has never been any real governance on behalf of our people. It's always the European based on a European model. Contrary to what we have been told, there has never been a process of convergence or mestizaje. It's the lie that basically there was some mutual consent and that there was two cultures that amalgamated or came together. The idea of the colonial model was for our people, the 5% that survived, to stop being ourselves and fully incorporate into the Western civilization, and therefore this colonial domination would have ended. In other words, to fully participate in our own genocide. There has been a systematic approach to destroy us as a culture and as a people, ranging from direct violence to massive destruction through biological warfare in the form of disease, but also from indirect assaults such as a forced labor either by the encomiendas, haciendas, the repartimientos, but also the forced introduction of their system of commerce, which always worked to the benefit of the Spaniards. This is what one colonizer wrote. They were given beasts of burden, so they do not have to carry things for themselves, wool to wear and meat to eat, all of which they lacked. They were shown the iron and oil lamps to improve their lives. They have been given money so that they may know what they buy and sell. They have been taught in Latin and in the sciences, which are more than whatever gold and silver was taken from them. Thus, they were free by being conquered, and even more by becoming Christians. But this system of colonization began in the midst of the youth also, beginning with the early Indian schools, where the Nica and Tlaco was taken out of them, where they were forced to accept Christianity and denounce our practices. It is by no accident that these youth then became the leaders of their designated towns and villages. He puts the idea of us embracing who we are as a people, not forgetting who we are, and makes a point on why we're still the same people, why we practice, even in the language that we speak, the Spanish that we speak, there's some Nahuatl language in there, how the foods that we practice, our faces, our physical, nature, the way we look. I mean, it's obviously there. We're not European.